Welcome to episode 595 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and Xavi is out and Hansi Flick is in, which means Levon, aka Barcelev, is also in. Because before we talk about Hansi Flick, I want to properly close the book on Xavi's managerial time in charge of FC Barcelona and give him a fitting send-off befitting of both a legend of the club and a manager that will not go down in history as anywhere close to a legend as a manager at FC Barcelona. So, Levon, I kind of want to start, I don't know. First, I want to get a general thought of the final saga as someone who's around Barcelona, who's at the club. What was that final little saga like where for the last time it felt like Xavi was convinced to stay and now he's gone again and now Hansi Flick is coming in. So just a quick aside on the little drama there at the end, which is unfortunate.
I mean, everybody who listens to the show has followed the news and what happened, where, like you said, Xavi said he was out. Then for a long time, everybody kept asking him, "Hey, you're really out? You're really out?" He said, "Well, yes, I haven't changed my mind. I haven't changed my mind." Until everybody did change their mind, and Laporta and Xavi agreed that he would stay. And okay, some people were happy. Some people thought that it would have been better for him to leave. But then as soon as those rumors started floating around that, Laporta was going to fire him, and it was very deliberate on the part of the club, because as soon as this started leaking and all of the newspapers said, sources from within the club, there was nobody from the club who actually came out to deny it. Not anybody. So to everybody here in Barcelona, it's super obvious that it came from the club. And everybody I would talk to, we were all upset about this. Because if you're going to let Xavi go, let him go with dignity. Let him go when Xavi himself already has a foot out the door. Don't pull him back through the door to then kick him out the door. It's ridiculous. It will only happen in Barcelona. It's completely unnecessary. If it were necessary, then you could have just, like I said, let him go 4 weeks ago. And everybody I talked to was disgusted by it. Independently of whether we feel that it's better or not for Xavi to leave, everybody is just upset about it and disgusted about how this happened.
Yeah, and I think to make matters worse from the PR standpoint, Barcelona had originally budgeted 11 million as Xavi's salary for next season, and he agreed to only take 2.5 million of that, which is what it cost him to break his contract with Al Sadd when he originally came. So basically what he was owed from the very beginning is what he decided to take. So that saves the club 8.5 million, which is going to financially allow them to bring in a totally new manager in Hansi Flick and the rest of his team, and potentially have a little bit of wiggle room there with the FFP. So for Xavi to do that after everything, after the yes and no and yes and no, and, I think whereas I always say there's smoke, there's fire, and I think Deco and Xavi were never the best of friends going back 20 years now. You get that sense, you get that understanding, and it is a frustrating thing that this legend of the club, I agree with you, that this legend of the club, not necessarily his own merits, but he said I was going to leave, and then they brought him back and back and forth again. So let's now look back on Xavi's time in charge, again, kind of getting rid of the emotion of it, and just look at him as a manager here. Because the first question was one that you and I, back, I think the first weekend of April, got into on social media. You and I went back and forth about where, not Xavi, but where Ernesto Valverde would stack up as the all-time managers of Barcelona. So you and I started listing, and I not to say that I've tried to put this into a science, because I'm going to give you my scientific, nerdy numbers answer, and then you can kind of expand upon it with the vibes and the feelings of these guys. So hitting you with your own list of Cruyff, Lucho, Pep, Louis van Gaal, Rinus Michels, Elenio Herrera, and Rijkaard. You had them as the ones that you considered Barcelona's best managers in the history. And then there's other names that I throw at you: Valverde, Jack Greenwell, Ferdinand Dauschik, Henrique Fernandez, Bobby Robson, Cesar Luis Minotti, and James Bellamy. All of the managers that I just named won 3 or more titles at Barcelona, with the exception of Rinus Michels, who actually only won 2 trophies, the great Dutch coach, of course. Fortunately, however, for him, one of those was the Liga in 1974 to win their first Liga in 13 years. So we'll say the weight of the trophy that he did win in a Liga was a little more outsized because it did bring, the club back to a place where, to a glory position. And so when I'm trying to compare Xavi, I don't put him in any of the names that I just mentioned as a manager, because the 4 managers whose time in charge best compares with Xavi's run based just on trophies, which is they won 2 trophies, was Roma Forns, who was a manager at Barça as they went from the Catalan Championship to the Liga in the late 20s. Patrick O'Connell, who coached during the start of the Spanish Civil War and still won 2 Catalan championships while the team was still doing both competitions. And then Josep Samitier, who won a La Liga and a Copa Eva Duarte in the mid-40s. And then Terry Venables, who won a La Liga and a Copa de la Liga, which was a competition that only ran during the mid-80s while Venables was in charge, which is completely forgotten now. But I did, going through that whole list that I just mentioned to you, I find the best comparison, interestingly enough, both as a player and now as a club legend as well, is Josep Samitier, who, yes, he did his work for Real Madrid, but again, this was the this was pre-Franco era of Real Madrid, all that kind of stuff. But Josep Samitier won the 2 trophies, but was a scout for the club for a long, long time, continued to give back to the club, had Gamper's ear for a long time after being a player as well, and was involved in the club. Again, was an advisor for different club presidents through the years as well, while also sitting in Real Madrid's booth as well. And so, yeah, while I don't expect Xavi to go across the aisle, the point is, I think as a manager, Samitier is not in any way remembered as a manager. He's remembered as a player, or for those who remember and all. And I think Xavi, the more time that goes on, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say he was a manager of Barcelona, but so was Carlos Reixac, who did it on multiple occasions, never won a trophy, and other guys. And I'm not comparing Reixac, the player, to Xavi, but it was a player who was at the club for a long time and seen as one of the Catalan sons. So my point is that Xavi, I think the longer this goes on, we're not going to remember his managerial career, especially if he doesn't come back or he stops managing in the next 3 to 5 years, wherever else he goes, or doesn't come back. And we're going to just continue to remember him as a legend, as a player throughout the decades and whatever, because that's where his legacy is truly going to lie.
Okay. You're looking at the past. I think the book is not closed on Xavi yet. I think he's way too addicted to football to stop managing anytime soon. So my hope is for him to become a successful coach elsewhere. And my hope is also for him, because it's very clear that he would like to come back to Barcelona, a club that he is leaving under terrible circumstances, but with his head held up high and with a lot of class. Like in his last press conferences, he refused to blame anybody at the club. He had nothing but good things to say about people at the club, and however we might feel about Xavi, and I certainly have had some gripes about how he sometimes whines a lot. I think this was incredibly classy, and I think we will remember his years in a positive light because of the league that he won, because of the players that have come through under his management, and because of how he left in the end. Because by remaining so positive about the club and supportive of the club, he controlled the narrative on how he stepped out of the door, not the people who kicked him out of the door in such a ridiculous manner.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because Ronald Koeman's also a legend of the club, but where I'd ask a lot of people, and shout out to the NYC Peña. I went to the Paella Day last week or 2 weeks ago, which was delightful. A paella, I always recommend those kind of days with the Peñas and hanging out with them, which is always great. But every person I would talk to, they all said, unfortunately, Xavi out. That was the answer, seemingly every single time. Unfortunately, Xavi out, which I think that is kind of how his run ends and how you felt about him this season, which was unfortunately Xavi out, because to your point, I agree. he's not the man for the job right now at the moment. And maybe he did arrive a little bit too soon, but I also don't think so. He was here for 2.5 years, and a lot of work was done. A lot of players were brought through. And it is well, what if did this happen? Or what if this player was different? Or what if business had been done differently? We don't know which players would have shown. And I said it in the last 5 headlines, and I know this short-term memory stuff, but I think Fermin Lopez is the second leading scorer on Barcelona only under Xavi. I don't think that player in particular. I think Lamine Yamal is amazing under everybody. I think Pau Barça, because of the finances, because of how good those kids were. I think unless it was a really, really pragmatic manager who does not play teenagers, just as a matter of principle, if it was any manager that was willing to take a teenager in talent, Lamine Yamal and Pau Barça would have broken through. But I don't think Fermin Lopez breaks through under anybody other than Xavi taking a chance and saying, I really like what I see in this kid, and I believe in this kid. And Fermin Lopez then backed all that up. And obviously he had to do the hard work himself. And I think when we talk about Xavi's time in charge, I kind of want to ask you, because I feel like, to your point about La Liga, I'm going to remember Xavi as an average manager who failed at times in the Champions League when the squad itself was not looking great on paper, and then wound up getting back to the Champions League knockouts. And even this season, his final season, didn't win any trophies. But that is the success argument against him this year, because all the other markers, which was get back to the quarterfinals of the Champions League, at least compete in the Liga, and get yourself in the Spanish Super Cup by finishing at least, second. And he was asked to do all these bare minimum markers, and he did all those things. And again, not winning a trophy was the one indictment of this season. But yeah, just winning last year, having won more points last season in the Liga than this year with far less luck on the defensive side of the ball has been interesting. And to your point on the field, my greatest indictment of Xavi in his whole campaign has been a failure to get the team to play in any semblance of consistent control when you didn't have Sergio Busquets, because you kind of give Sergio Busquets the credit for that control, because every time they were devoid of him, including this entire season, they're devoid of not to say a game plan, but it seems like an understanding of how to pace through a match is not there. That there was not a unit or the individual talent, but the unit just wasn't there in cohesion to work through that. So yeah, it was a squad that continued to have a ton of holes and issues with depth, but it was also a squad that had injected a ton of talent with big spending as well, who also dealt with a ton of injuries. But you could go through all the big clubs that are trying to win the Champions League, and you can have that argument for each of them. So looking back on his whole tenure, I'll ask you 2 questions in one, and we can take a break in the middle and go back. But what is your high point and what is your low point? Because I'm really having a hard time figuring out what the highest high was and what the lowest low was.
The high point was the 4-0 victory in Madrid.
With Aubameyang.
Yeah, with Aubameyang. Yeah. To touch upon whether Fermin Lopez would break through under other coaches, I don't think he was a good coach. But one thing that we can say about Ronald Koeman is he gave all the kids a chance, and sometimes way more over the experienced players. So I think that Koeman and Xavi had that in common. And Pedri joined the club, and everybody was like, okay, well, Pedri's gonna play the preseason to see if he's gonna stay at the club or if he's gonna go out for a loan. And Koeman just played him every position as long as he was on the pitch. He played on the wing. He played pivot one day. He always played. So Koeman played Balde when Balde was nowhere near ready. He started Balde in the Champions League games.
I think Elias Moriba is hoping that Koeman. I think Elias Moriba is hoping that Koeman is a manager anywhere, because that was the one guy that believed in him.
He played Elias Moriba, exactly, and Moriba played well under Koeman. Mm-hmm. He also played Nico Gonzalez, who actually had a stretch as our best midfielder for a short run of games. Xavi gave a lot of young people their chance, but also Xavi completely screwed over Ansu Fati by playing him longer than the medical staff advised Xavi to play Ansu Fati, after which he suffered that muscle injury that he took a very long time to recover from. then when Ansu Fati played well during this preseason, Xavi didn't want him and sent him to Brighton. And we're having trouble in our attack this season. I think an Ansu Fati with confidence, and Ansu Fati that is given confidence by the coach, might have made a difference there. Also, you mentioned Busquets. We didn't replace Busquets. Well, it's Xavi who, during a whole preseason, insisted on playing Pjanic, which made Nico Gonzalez look for the exit. And then when Nico Gonzalez left, we sold Pjanic. So I think that those are two players that, if taken care of directly and nurtured directly, would have addressed some significant pain points for us. And I would say more than not winning any titles, those would be possibly my biggest pain points. I think the low light was playing Ansu Fati longer than the medical staff advised, which was the game in which Ansu Fati ended up injured. Because I truly believe that kid was special, and the world might never really see him live up to the potential that he had.
Yeah, that's a really good argument that I think is kind of forgotten in that it was Xavi's choice. That he brought back Ricard Pruna, which was a guy from his era that he trusted, and it seemed like there were times where he would trust the medical staff, and then times that he wouldn't. And I think the indictment of that is Dembele, that Xavi really, really believed in Dembele, and now he's gone to PSG. And now I'm talking about form. I mean, the guy's playing. And that has a lot to do with luck, of course, and it has to do with physios and stuff like that. But yeah, it's how a manager chooses to use you as well. And I think that would, again, be the indictment. And I don't want to trickle into some of the Hansi Flick questions that I'm going to have, but Barcelona want to take the ball back in the opponent's third of the field. That's what they want to do. That's the way they see their identity. They want to use their rest defense, and they want to press high. But if you're going to do that, you have to have the players to do that, and you have to make sure that everybody's kind of not only healthy but prepared to have the rotation and squad depth to do that and be able to handle that as a unit. And I think over this last year, every time Pedri's been healthy, he and Lewandowski together, it just seems like, not that Lewandowski isn't doing what he's asked to do, but there's again no cohesion in that press. There's so many times that I'm like, why is Pedri making a mistake by jumping there, or is he running around like a chicken with his head cut off for this reason, or why is he, is it an issue with Pedri individually? Is he not doing instructions right? Or is it just Pedri's being asked to do too much running on a player that, if there's one guy you don't want to have running that much, it's that kid for the last, year or whatever it is, or 2 years. So I think that Xavi had ideas, and I think this is, again, how I would sum up his first, big job, if you will, that he had ideas that I really liked. And I think when he would speak in pressers and he would say, this is what I want to do, I think he always had his mind, and especially loving the club and loving the players, it felt like he had his mind and his heart in the right place. But his execution, to that point, there were always so much naivety. And then when I think of, not necessarily about low point with Xavi, it's just, I can't tell you and I talked about this last time you were on, how many match reviews I wrote, even if they didn't come out with the energy they needed or the intangibles in the first 5 minutes. There were so many times when I look at how the team was set up and the idea that you clearly saw Barcelona have, and I'm like, Xavi did his homework. He knew what the weakness of the other team was going to be. And either his team didn't know how to execute what his ideas were, which I think was his biggest issue to me, that his team was not executing what he was asked to do. And that's, I think the proof is in the pudding that he got ejected from so many games. And every time the camera panned to him for the last 2.5 years, he's screaming bloody murder on the sideline, because I think he really did. I mean, I compared him in the past, and I'll do it again, to Thierry Henry when he was a manager. That it was a guy that just, there was so much talent there. There was so many ideas in his head, and there was some lost in translation from the manager to from the touch line to the guys on the field. And Thierry Henry had that problem. Frank Lampard had that problem. Xavi has that problem. It happens to these high level players. It doesn't always work out that way, that a guy is going to be an amazing player with great ideas and then be able to translate that into coaching prowess. And sometimes even that coaching prowess takes experience, to your point. So I don't have necessarily a low light. I think every time they were eliminated in the Champions League, like the Inter Milan, like that loss, because again, it was the handball with Ansu Fati, as in like there should have been a handball in Inter Milan. Like again, we're litigating that, or even the PSG Araujo thing. It's just like every time you're litigating from the Champions League and you feel like it should have been you and it isn't, that's going to be a low light for a manager. So I think I go back to Inter Milan because that was a moment when I said, Xavi, it looked like you have it. Like the team is playing well in the Liga. You have all this talent, and your Champions League is over in October, and that or November, whatever it was. You're before Christmas, they're out of Champions League, and it's just like obviously for me creating content, it breaks me. And so that was my lowest point, at least under Xavi, to be like, oh, I'm going to lose half of my listeners, and it's November, and it's like, what am I going to do for the next 10 months? And it's just a disaster.
I think that's possibly the low light for the club, but I don't think that was on Xavi because most of them were.
Yeah, that's what I feel too.
Two
Yeah,
moments that did not go our way. I think one of the things that Xavi keeps saying is that the club was in such a difficult situation. But when you actually look when Xavi took over, the first transfer window he had, we signed. Help me out here. We signed Ferran Torres.
It was Ferran Torres, Aubameyang, Adama Traore,
Adama.
And Eric Garcia.
And Eric Garcia. Did we sign Eric Garcia? No, Eric Garcia.
No, he was the summer. He came in the summer.
Exactly, yeah. So we signed like a whole new attack within a couple of months of Xavi being appointed, and then the next summer we spent more money than pretty much any other club with the Palancas. We signed Lewandowski, Koundé, Rafinha. We got Christensen and Cachet. So that argument does not really hold any water for me. But what is interesting, and I think we discussed this on a previous podcast, is that last summer he lost Dembele and Busquets, and those two losses were absolutely devastating. As much as you love Lamine Yamal, that kid does not give us what Dembele gives us in terms of danger and outlet for attack. Because Dembele was in his prime. And
right. And Lamine Yamal's 16. There's no comparison. It's just like, so one is a 16-year-old kid who will likely be better than Dembele on paper if it all works out, but that's an if, and there's a long time before that. But
exactly.
Yeah, it's a different thing.
And it's not a coincidence that our defense fell apart without Busquets either. So how is the club going to solve that with or without Xavi? Is another conversation. But those were huge difference makers for Xavi. Some of the injuries also. I think the only thing that we can really point at this season that I think Xavi did wrong was that he played Balde really high up the pitch, which is not a role that suits Balde at all, because it does not leave him any space to take advantage of, and he's not that good of a passer or footballer to play without space. So you want him to be able to take advantage of his physical qualities and start from further out back, where he has a lot of space in front of him, where he can dribble past players and break the lines. I thought this was pretty clear from the beginning that Balde was being used incorrectly, and that's really the only tactical problem that I would see this summer for Xavi. This season.
Well, to my count, Frankie de Jong, Pedri, and Gabi were all healthy and fit for 6 matches this year, which is, impossible to set up what is supposed to be your midfield trio with when you're missing at least one or sometimes two and sometimes all three of who is supposed to be your first choice midfield. You can't actually commit and set something up, whether it's a double pivot with Frankie de Jong and Pedri, with Gabi farther forward, which I think has the most potentially. But yeah, there are issues with that, but they also had no time to build that up. And then I think it's a credit to Xavi to switch and say, Christensen, defensive midfielder, we're going to change that up. And I think this season, he wasn't so dogmatic that he just kept it. He did change things up. And even the Koundé thing, where last season, I think there was a lot more questions and marks about Koundé, center back and right back. And it sounds like this season, Koundé's like, actually, I'm one of the best, on form. I'm one of the better right backs in world football. And yeah, I mean, he hasn't been perfect at the end of the season, but he's been as good as anybody this season
Very, very
under
true.
Xavi,
Very
and
true.
to a point where he can redefine his career if he decides to go elsewhere or be sold. That I can be a center back, I can be right back at a really high level, regardless of where you send me. So to kind of reposition Jules Koundé after that big sale to a right back, I think is a positive thing about
Yeah.
Xavi. Now, before we go, and this is a little bit
Hold
short.
on, hold on. Moving Rafinha to the left, which is something that I've been
It's also
begging
great.
for.
Yep.
You know, everybody was like, "No, he cannot play on the left. He cannot play on the left." I think me and maybe a handful of people were the only ones in the world saying, "Play him on the left." And Xavi eventually did that. Maybe not in the way that I envisioned that he would play on the left, but it worked really well, especially in big games or against tough competition. So yeah, Xavi did find footballing solutions. I think on the other side, or on the other hand, there have been a lot of matches where I just wanted to get like heat up my knife on a gas stove and poke my eyes out because I just couldn't get through them. They were like, we've had some pretty gnarly matches.
Gnarly is the right word.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been some stinkers. Like I mean, again, I make the 5 headlines every time, and to me, in a whole season, this is now my 3rd or 4th year doing 5 headlines, and I feel like there are so many times when I'll, after a match, say, "Do I even have 5 headlines? Do I have enough for 5 things to talk about?" And then there are other matches where you can combine it all together. And goals, of course, are one thing. We always talk about the goals, but there were so many matches this season where I go back to my 5 headlines and I go, "It feels redundant. How many times can I mention Lamine Yamal in the same way? How many times can I mention the same?" What the João Felix cameo? How many times can I say the same thing about Lewandowski in the first half of the season struggling for form, right? And it just seemed it got so repetitive there in the middle of the season, especially. And then again here at the end, you take the foot off the gas to second place. But yeah, I felt like Xavi's teams, there would be whole halves where you're just like, or trying to, especially in big matches too. I think that was another big indictment of Xavi. And I think what separates Xavi as, a high level manager, whatever you want to call it, from some of the other guys we mentioned, like a Lucho, or Luis Enrique, or even Guardiola, or Heleno Herrera going back in history or whatever. And then actually Valverde at Athletic Club is a very similar comparison now, not at Barcelona, but at Athletic Club, that they have their teams coming up to big games and big matches. And I think my frustration with Xavi's time in charge, I think, again, it's not a low point, but I think one of the negatives of his time in charge, where I don't know, it's the same thing with Koeman too, where I would see them building something. There'd be good matches. You'd have good feelings sometimes, but then it'd be a big match. You call it a quote unquote big match, and Barcelona wouldn't be up to snuff. How many times in this tenure, other than we talk about the 4-0 Real Madrid, of course, but and the Spanish Super Cup in last January, but how many big matches did Xavi get his team up for? And they didn't have to be the better team even. They could be the worst team, but get the result. And I don't know how many times that
Koeman was a
happened.
disaster. I mean, there's no comparison. Koeman did not win, or did not even get draws.
No,
Uh,
yeah, he lost. He lost every big match he could, right?
he,
And that's why he was
he,
gone.
lost, he lost everything. He won against Juve at the beginning of the season. The Juve is not even what it was. But then he went and lost 3-0 when we played the second match against Juve. But Koeman was a nightmare, and against Atleti, we lost every match. So Xavi beat Atleti 4-1 and beat Madrid 4-0. The first his first season, and that first season he also beat Napoli in a very convincing way. Then the next season, I think we beat Madrid twice.
Yes, it was the Spanish Super Cup and then the El Clasico. Yeah.
Oh, in that case, we beat them 3 times because we beat them in the Spanish Super Cup where we just played them off the park.
Yeah, 4-0
We,
with
we,
Xavi
we,
and Pedri. Yeah.
we beat them in the 2-1 where Kessie got the winner in the 90th minute.
And then the 1-0 Copa del Rey with the possession. That's right.
Exactly, the one where we basically Mourinho'd Madrid.
Yeah. I think that's the most interesting game under Xavi's regime. Not in a bad way. That game, that 1-0 is the most, like, that one is just this outlier game that I think about. I go, I don't know how that happened or what happened, but I mean, yeah, of course they turned it in the second leg, so that changed the narrative. But if Barcelona hung on the second narrative, that would have been one for the ages.
Exactly. And then this season, okay, we did not beat Madrid, but we outplayed them for a long stretch. In both games, arguably.
Yeah, in the first half.
Especially the home game. We got unlucky. We hit the post twice. And the game against Napoli was good. We beat Atleti both legs again. We beat Paris and Paco Plans. So no, I think this club was very promising in big games. I think the problems were more that we lost against Manchester United and we lost against Frankfurt. Frankfurt. Those were very disappointing. His first Champions League games were very disappointing, but it was a very weird group stage because of everything that happened during those matches.
Yeah.
I don't think that he did poorly as a coach or as a manager in big matches. We were better than Bayern Munich when we played them away, at least.
Yeah, I don't want to trivialize it with the number, but I think with that final point here, I would give, man, this is hard. Out of 10, I'm setting you up because I'm going to try to have to think about this on the fly. If I were to give Xavi a final ranking 1 out of 10 of his time in charge, again, comparing him to other managers at the club, I think I would land somewhere at like maybe a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10 as far as his time in charge. I mean, am I too low? Am I too high?
I'm going to give him an X, and not the Roman X, but a mathematical X.
Okay, then I'll just give him an O if that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. Okay, so I think that ends. Thankfully, for a little while, we can talk about Xavi, the player legend, again. I am going to leave my Hansi Flick commentary for next week, but I do have enough time in this show to ask you about that. So I think the big questions I have for you before they get answered, some of these Flick questions that have already come up, is about which players will have to impress in preseason. And for me, at least, the biggest questions are Balde, Vitor Roque, Ansu Fati, the two Zhaos and their transfer business. And then Sergio Roberto, the last 48 hours, could be a huge question mark as well, because not so much about what he is on the field, but what he truly can and how he does affect the team as the first captain, and how, obviously, if it was a Spanish manager, they might feel a certain way about Sergio Roberto, and a German manager might not feel the same way about Sergio Roberto and might see him merely as a talent. So of the names that I kind of threw at you, coming into the preseason, what eyes or which players are you going to have your eyes on the most with Hansi Flick and impressing, and how that's all going to go down, with the first match coming, I believe, just exactly 2 months from now, July 30th, against Man City in a friendly. I think so. Exactly 2 months from today is the first preseason match for Hansi Flick.
I mean, it's such a mind, pardon my French, because
I got to beep it out. So you heard, everybody heard the beep. Sweet.
That's okay. You'll beep it out, because all of the players that are on the chopping block are players that, if you look at Hansi Flick and how he coached his successful team, and then you look at our squad, Araujo, the highlight that Hansi Flick plays, there's no way that we can sell Araujo. Rafinha is the only fast forward that we have that can defend and that presses. Even Frankie de Jong, if you say, well, Hansi Flick, he plays in a 4-2-3-1, then you're like, well, if you're going to play in a 4-2-3-1, are you really going to sell the one player that we have who has always been amazing at Ajax and in the Dutch national team? Like, he's an absolute dominant force when you give him the free roll in that double pivot in teams that try to attack reasonably fast. So then if you don't sell these guys, who is left to sell really? My eyes would be on Vitor Roque because I think this is also a huge failure of either Xavi or the club. And I tend to put these things on the coach. If the coach doesn't, either you veto a player or you play him, you don't ruin him when he arrives. And I don't care if your name is Xavi or Valverde or whoever. So my eyes would be on Vitor Roque. Like, is he not playing because he's really, really, really terrible? Or is he not playing because Xavi just values certain qualities in a player that Vitor Roque doesn't have? You know? Whereas maybe Flick would appreciate his pressing and the way he can play into space. I think Balde would also benefit from a more vertical minded coach, especially as like we said before, if you play Balde from further out back and you don't have a starting point that far up. So my questions would really be, hey, who's going to be left to sell? And at that point, will Flick say, okay, I believe more in this squad than the one we can build without you selling us players? There might be players that the club is not ready to sell. I think João Felix is probably out.
I can't imagine him succeeding under Hansi Flick. And this is, I mean, the old baseball adage, 3 strikes, you're out. I mean, it was 1 Atletico Madrid, 2 at Chelsea, and 3 at Barcelona. I mean,
exactly.
Whatever value he had is not his value, whether Jorge Mendes thinks has value or not.
I think if you really need to make money, then you might be looking at selling either Koundé or Christensen. If you sell Koundé, then you play Cancelo on the right. And to be honest, Cancelo moved to the left. I think around the same time that Lamine Yamal really consolidated on the right wing. But a Cancelo-Lamine Yamal partnership seems very natural. It seems that, with their playing styles and both being able to make short passes and combine, it seems like that could work. And then maybe that gives you the chance to play Balde on the left in a more conservative role. Maybe you even make space for what's the guy's name? Mika Faye, the Senegalese from Barça B, where you have another fast player who can correct and has a decent pass. And you play a high defensive line, and you might be able to play him as a left back. I don't know, as well. So that gives you another option. I think one player who might have a harder time coming back to the club is Eric Garcia.
Yeah,
I don't see a clear one.
Yeah, I mean, on wages alone, he financially, it makes sense to have him come back just because
Right.
his wages are still very low. And financially, can you get more for Inigo Martinez on the market than you can because Inigo Martinez wages are even, I believe, a little bit higher. We're splitting hairs here when comparing them to what Lewandowski makes in 6 months. But, at the bottom of your roster, how do you make the most of the money that you have in FFP? And I believe, selling Inigo Martinez for $8 million would and bringing back Eric Garcia would probably give you the exact same production, except now you have another right-footed center back. But I seem to think that matters less and less as we go on in time. And to your point, I want to make too about the Koundé Christensen thing. With Christensen adapting to the defensive midfielder spot in the second half of the season, and Koundé, as we said, really shining it right back. If you sell them, and you sell them for ideally the pivot that you want, and I use quotes on there because I don't know if that actually a thing that exists in the real world or reality, unless the Nike deal goes through and there's money. I don't want to be too pessimistic. And then the left wing, and the name that keeps the dream signing is Nico Williams. I think everyone agrees with that from Athletic Club. And as I've said on in the past, I don't see him going this summer, but I could easily see him going next summer, and that makes sense to me. But you also never know how much EPL clubs are coming in and giving a Godfather offer to say, hey, we want to do the release clause now. And Athletic Club are just, all right, we have to accept it because that's the way it goes. So I said, if you sell Christensen and Koundé, those would be, I agree with you, the two players that could fetch you the most on the transfer market, would hurt you the least in FFP, and would allow you the funds to then put that in a one-to-one situation for a pivot and a left wing, which, again, functionally helps your team a lot more. Like having an actual left winger functionally helps your team, and keeping Rafinha in the squad, he also does a job. And Lamine Yamal isn't supposed to play another 4,000 minutes this season. For the love of good golly gosh, don't let him do that. So having another left winger who can play on either side is not a bad thing at a high level. And then, of course, that pivot thing, as we talked about, like there's no way Hansi Flick in any system he played with the German national team or with Bayern Munich is going to survive without even if you play a double pivot with Frankie de Jong, you need an actual, like a guy who is a pivot, a defensive midfielder who is a pivot, and that's his job, to cut out, to not only be a destroyer, but also to help build when Frankie de Jong gets free and allow him to be free, the way Christensen did in the few games that they had overlapped with. So again, if you're going to sell Koundé and Christensen, which I agree, those are the two names, but you don't get the two players who come in, like I'm not saying an Aura Romeu, but I mean, let's say you wind up, it becomes musical chairs, and Guido Rodriguez, who is now questionable because he was coming because of Xavi, and now like Guido Rodriguez winds up being the player, and then you're telling me, well, you sold Christensen and Koundé, I'm going to say for what? Because it might not work out that way. So if you're going to sell those two, you got to get it right. And that's the high risk, high reward of any major club, of course, but especially for Barcelona when the margins are so small. So I'm interested to see Hansi Flick's pull with a player like Joshua Kimmich, where Kimmich, of course, Bayern Munich, I mean, why, you know what I mean? Why would they not take push Barcelona for all the money they could get? And is he even a perfect fit? I don't know. But is that player willing to make some concessions to kind of say to Bayern Munich, hey, I think maybe the time is come for me to go to Barcelona and this kind of number. Kind of the same way that Robert Lewandowski did, who also won Barcelona a league and now makes way too much. But that's a problem that Barcelona, as you know, they've done throughout their history. They're going to kick that can down the road when it comes to contracts and bringing in a player that they want in their prime to win in the short term. I mean, that's what could happen. So the last question I have for you, I think,
very nice, because unlike Xavi, Hansi Flick is a new coach, and the advantage of being a new coach is if Xavi says, "Well, you know, I'm not gonna play you much this season," you're gonna have players who say, "Well, yeah, you say that, but you don't mean it."
mm-hmm.
If a new coach comes in and says, "Look, you do not fit my philosophy at all, and I'm not gonna play you," you have a better chance of getting a player to accept to leave. So, you know, it could be Koundé, it could be Christensen, it could also be Ferran Torres, by the way, who has still not completely convinced, and is also not really that prototype forward that the Hansi Flick has been successful with.
That's actually the other name that I've seen circulated, because he was bought 3 years. Yeah, because he was bought 3 years ago, the amortization on his contract is now much, much more reasonable. So you might be able to get a profit on Ferran Torres. So that is, I think that both for financial reasons and for the X and O's reasons and his own playing time and him believing, and I think he does rightfully believe that he could be a starter somewhere, but I don't think it's at Barcelona.
Right, but then how many forwards would we be left with? We'd be left with Vitor Roque, Lewandowski, Rafinha, Lamine Yamal.
I think Fermin Lopez is a forward. I think he's a forward, and you should call him a forward under Hansi Flick, especially once Gabi comes back. There's just too many other midfielders that Fermin Lopez, if he wants minutes, he's going to put to play as a forward.
Okay. I think Fermin Lopez, because Hansi Flick likes to crowd the box a lot with people that flood in from midfield.
Yeah.
And I think Fermin is very good at that, better than Pedri, better than Gavi.
I can see him playing him in the same role he played. Well, I could see Fermin playing in the same role that Musiala played in right before Hansi Flick left Bayern Munich, where he played at that. It wasn't really a false nine type thing, but he played as that highest midfielder type thing up there. Not really even a 10, where it was just like, hey, it's not a 4-3-3, it's not a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-3-1. well, it kind of was a 4-2-3-1, and you just had Musiala almost not say wherever he wanted to be, but whether you called him a forward or a midfielder, depending on how the opposition was setting
Yeah,
up their shape.
I guess that's
Now, I
true.
don't want to get
Except
too
that Musiala
dogmatic
is
with
more of a
numbers.
playmaker.
He is.
So it'd be a very different role. No, but I mean, it's going to be interesting, and my God, let's hope he is successful, because it can go either way.
I couldn't say it better myself. And next week, I'm really going to be digging in. Hopefully, it's scheduled. People always know when I plug this and I say we're going to talk a little bit about tactics. People try to schedule, so hopefully he's going to be talking to me about Hansi Flick and all the X's and O's and stuff next week. So in the meantime, though, this weekend the Barça Athletic enter the playoffs with matches this Sunday and next Saturday against Ibiza in the first round of the playoffs. And I will not be doing 5 headlines for that. 5 headlines done for the season. I did it. I am a completionist, and we did it. So congratulations to all of you, Patreons and everyone else, for finishing all those 5 headlines. We made it to the end of another season. So, Levon, this will wrap up this show, but this will wrap up the season as well. I always appreciate you making the time, buddy.
All right, man. Take care. Visca Barça.
Yep. And again, thanks to the listeners and the audience and wherever you are. Thanks on the podcast apps and subscribing to the YouTube channel. Always a big help, especially in the off season when numbers might be down. These are the times that I try to work on some more fun stuff that take more time. And it allows me, again, number of subscribers and helping the podcast apps helps me get outside sponsors and helps me continue to make that specialty content that isn't so reliant on matches. So I always remind people, especially if you're here at the end, if you're not subscribed, please do it. Most importantly, though, thanks so much for listening to the show. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon. And Forza Barça.